the Prime Minister for that, yep, for that fine speech. I call upon Leader of Opposition. Here.
Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Oh my goodness. If you want to appeal, I just do it through chat. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. For you, Machiavelli might be about power and glory. Actually, for me, it's about leftism. And that's okay, because that's the ideology I resonate most with. But that's a great example of how true meaning, whatever that means, does not matter at all, or even does not exist within literature. Because once an author puts out a book out there, once they put out a text into the world, that becomes democratic information that everyone can battle with on their own. I also think that it's so interesting that PM says, judge a book rather than judge a person. Because I think whether rightly or wrongly or differently you judge a piece of literature, you're still judging just that literature. You're not really judging the author, right? You're judging the ideas that is within that. What is this debate ultimately about then, right? By weight, we mean social weight in determining interpretation. So this debate is to defend what ought to be when society as a collective interprets the writing. We're defending that literary criticism can evaluate text and respect the ways in which people differently interpret as it is most meaningful towards them, whether or not it actually resonates with the author, right? But also not impose social scrutiny towards people who read works that's written by, say, a racist or maybe a convicted rapist or a criminal or things like that. The interpretation of a text then is how it's used in institutions like schools, or whether it's published, or who is willing to publish it, right? Or whether it is legitimate text to write as an academic paper on. In essence, it's literary criticism, and assigning weight, sure, could be in the abstract sense, but could also be very personal as well. But for the most part, this is how it manifests in society. This is how it should manifest in society. Two arguments on my side then. First, how knowing the text as personal interaction and are really imposing the burdens of an author makes you interact with it a lot better. And second of all, how it improves the scope of literature. First argument, we see 3 reasons why this creates personal relationships with literature. First of all, is that it's a window to your own lives, the reader's lives. Interpret scenarios however you want to interpret those scenarios, how you're able to derive the highest level of meaning. For instance, Animal Farm by George Orwell had an important childhood, but people ended up understanding this book and liking this book because they could understand history a little bit better. It is a fantasy book that people just wanted to enjoy and see it in an entertaining way. Paradise Lost is meant to be a comforting or feel-good book, but when you know that the author lost his whole family when writing this book, this just shift the experience in a way that you did not consent to have your experience be shifted when reading this book. It could also be a historical book that captures events that people interpret for themselves, and no one has ownership over that event. No one has ownership over your thoughts, right? People should be allowed to experience things as they resonate most with it. Sure, when you read Paradise Lost, you might have gone through a tough moment and you needed that positive outlook on life, or you're at a high point in your life and you want to forget about all the hurtful past, right? You're not supposed to be forced to see it in the light that the author wants you to see it in, even if they have that desire. That interpretation should not be publicized in a way that shifts the way that someone can resonate with the text. The great parallel is this, right? If a CAP makes a motion, you can say that's my motion, but you cannot say it's my motion because it might have been used before. It might have been constructed from many different ideas of many different people, but we can still have debates around it and we can still talk about it in a productive way. Secondly, is that autobiographies still exist on our side. They're also literary texts that hold a lot of value, right? So when we're talking about personability and if the author actually wants to, and if someone wants to actually read someone's life or read about someone's life, they can just read an autobiography. That's also an important text, literary text, right? It could impart wisdom to the public. That's the wisdom that they want to be imparted, and that's the wisdom that the public actually want to consume. They can read autobiographies. Thirdly, is that we need text to resonate with the population who don't have literary minds for themselves. I'm using this kind of loosely, literary minds. For instance, children, right? They read Roald Dahl, who's actually an anti-Semite. If children were reading it and said that every character they resonate with is actually a Nazi and every bad guy is a Jewish person, then they will grow up maybe being a racist or maybe being very, very disturbed by this. They can't meaningfully extract you can't force them to meaningfully extract meaning. And their shallow interpretation is okay, but that's not just children. Some people want to view literature as just social enjoyment and nothing more. This is basically poetry, this is like basically a poetry example, not really a book or literature, but like the song Ring Around a Rosie is a pocket full of poesy. It's actually about the Black Death song, right? It ruined my childhood when I found out that it's actually about the Black Death. And every time I hear that poem, I think about people dying in the Black Death, and I don't want to think that because it actually has attachment to a lot of fun memories of singing that song or like singing that piece of poetry. It's sad that that you scrutinize people when you say actually like I love Gatsby because it's glam and glitz and not simplification of class structure as viewed from the lens of high class maneuvering F. Scott Fitzgerald. It's okay. You're allowed to enjoy those books regardless of how you viewed that author, and it's okay to enjoy your experiences. The idea is, yes, complex understanding can be derived from books and writing, but you ought not be shamed or ought not be forced to immerse yourself in that background. And if you do want to immerse yourself in the background, you can just read an autobiography and you'll be fine. Fourthly, is that ideas in a book and is a social and public good and should not be an excludable good and should not be rivalrous either. No single person has ownership over ideas. And once an author puts a text out there, they should treat it as a public good. In that sense, they should be absorbed by the public as a public good. Authors should also not be able to clarify their thoughts, because at that point you're claiming ownership over other people's thoughts. Quickly appeal if there is one from OG.
Your ruined childhood is actually good because you're getting more awareness. How would you say that your hedonism, your fun, and glorifying your childhood, it's based on lack of awareness, is better compared to being more aware of racism?
Well, the example I gave with that exact poetry, the example I gave with other pieces of literature are specifically attached to specific memories that I did not want ruined. I could have learned about Black Death in history books, which I did. I could have learned about history from many other sources. I did not consent to having my childhood ruined. I did not consent to having specific memories ruined. Second point then is how it improves the scope of literature. Firstly, there's lots of authors write anonymously for very legitimate reasons as well. We don't think this piece of literature should be disregarded in the public. But the norm is now that authors who write anonymously are actually harassed. Like, people seek out their identity because there's this idea that you can only place value if there is an author attached to it. Sometimes anonymous writing is very, very valuable. The norm that an author provides important interpretation leads to things like harassment and invasion of privacy. But second of all, is that we democratize literature. That's just because a book was written by a famous or influential person doesn't mean that the ideas hold more weight than a book that's written by nobody. We want to allow ideas to be freely and democratically expressed, in that even if you're a nobody from a broken background who have no proficiency in literature, your personhood matters if you have, or like your person does not have to matter if you have great ideas. Put it out there. It democratizes literature. Third of all is that you place more value on text for its merit, right? Marx looked around and said, this system sucks. He wasn't a peasant. He's a highly literate scholar, but he wrote one of the most influential pieces in human history. The Communist Manifesto was and is so revolutionary. It was passed from government to government, society to society. If you judge Marx's text by its background, someone who's part of the class he scrutinized, aka the bourgeoisie, then other people will not accept his text. The world will not accept his text, and history would not be the way it is because the world inherently rejects things they deem to be hypocrisy. So you will not get a lot of these very influential texts that we get that actually changes the scopes of history and government if you're going to judge the author by their identity. Vote for OO.
All right, I thank the leader of opposition for that.
Everyone hear me?
Yep.
Oh, just before I start my speech, shout out to the person over there. It's her birthday today. Woo! Okay. Just want to say that. All right, I'm gonna start my speech now. When I read a book, I'm able to gain a lot of knowledge from it. I'm able to learn about hatred, friendship, about love, about many other themes that are important to the human experience. No book, DPM, sees the world in rose-tinted glasses because books have complexities, and as you go older, you are more likely to want to interpret even more information from more books. So I think they were arguing on a premise that was really, really wrong and didn't understand what the status quo looked like. Two different things. Firstly, authors don't have ownership rights over their works. And secondly, that you have greater enjoyment for readers now on our side of the house. Before that, a couple pieces of framing, three in particular. One, I don't think any team can define art. Big mistake from the Prime Minister. I think art is defined by whoever observes it, and no one has ownership over my mind and how I choose to interpret it. But two, I think different literary critiques, communities, etc., have their own ways of interpreting books on our side anyway. Someone from Indonesia might interpret a book differently from someone from the West, for example. People compete in interpretation and create vigorous debates around it on either side of the house. They create vigorous debates around it even if you don't know who was writing this book. That's why you get a lot of the community analysis that they said was exclusive on their side of the house to be non-existent, because on our side, you could do that as well. Third, to be clear, authors could probably still sell their books on our side of the house. We just like imagine a world where hardcover books look much nicer and can be sold for more just because they're printed. I think if it's an ebook, they could probably still get paid, as it took a long time to make. So I just want to like take that out in case the closing government might want to bring a silly argument about this. Before that, let's see what their material was and how they thought it was really mind-boggling, right? The first thing they said was that there's a danger with objectivity, and that's real, right? I think the culture of reading text can happen anyway. Hermeneutics is still a system of understanding the Bible. You have figurative languages on our side of the house that helps you understand how to interpret text. These tools are not texts, they are tools that allow you to understand books better and create critical analyses about it. So you can't just say that this book means X because I think X, right? You probably have to look at the text and say, I support this hypothesis by this text. And people still do that on our side of the house because schools exist, because English, just like literature still exists, because people still major in literature in our side of the house. Secondly, they said the only benefit you gain is hedonism, right? Good like way of trying to strawman the argument, right? Because sometimes books let you heal from toxic relationships. Sometimes it's how you connect with your family, how you allowed yourself to feel safe in a world that was insanely mean and rude to you. What if it was Harry Potter? What if that was the book for you, right? You'd have to forget your enjoyment to that book and bar yourself from ever understanding those relationships in the same exact way, because I was enjoying it by an author who was deeply, deeply mistaken, right? Or deeply, deeply wrong. So that means I think you actually don't just lose hedonism as the opening government straw man, you instead lose a lot of really meaningful connections and relationships and memories that were exclusive to you, but was somehow forced away from you because someone else told you this is not what the author was trying to intend. But I actually think that utility and hedonism is fine to be prioritized. People search for that everywhere in their lives. They work themselves so long in the office so that they can gain some sense of happiness on the weekends, for example. People are allowed to enjoy themselves, and I don't know why opening government thinks this is not a worthy benefit. Third, they said you can't have debates about books on your side. You'll decrease dissenting voices. I'm genuinely confused by the Prime Minister. Opposing the death of the author means validating a singular objective truth. What does that mean? That means you empower bourgeois elitist beliefs of how to correctly understand text, saying to someone that you are not correct because you do not understand it in the same sophisticated way that I do. You are excluding so many people from being able to enjoy books on your side of the house. They said this is important to increase awareness. Unexclusive, there are schools, parents, friends, the news, social media, and everything else that I can list out for many, many minutes across this speech. These alternatives are probably better for people because it actually provides you the context that you would actually necessitate. But DBL's clarification was ridiculous. You can gain the benefit from the book first, but then get traumatized later when you find out about the author. I don't really understand this. I think it's better for you to just be able to gain the benefit from the book. Lastly, they said, let your childhood get ruined because you can gain much more benefits. No, often books are the things that teaches you life lessons, as I already illustrated in my opening, and teaches you friendship, trust, love. These are things that are important to learn. And if someone just tells you these things are wrong, that creates dissonance in your mind. That makes you unable to actually gain the benefits that you initially did gain. You can learn about distrust through bad friendships on our side as well, by the way. I just genuinely think so many of these life lessons that they talk about don't have to come from rejecting certain books, which is what must happen to learn these lessons on OG. I instead think you lose all understanding on proposition when one characteristic of the one author forces you to forget, reject, and not prioritize the knowledge gained from one book. Unfortunately, for the opening government, they wanted to argue a harm that they didn't realize was much greater on their side. All the rebuttal has already been able to flip OG. Yeah, POI, OG.
Intellect and hedonism has lots of other sources, but most importantly, death of author also has its dark side where there is an erasure of their life stories too. What kind of things do your tools to criticize have? Because so much wealth is lost in this kind of discourse.
That's a good argument. You know, you can probably suggest that authors are able to maintain their lives, right? Through those books. I actually argue, and even my first argue, which you did not respond to, as to why authors don't have ownership over these books, right? The reason is because when writing is made, it is an idea dispersed into society. You are no longer in ownership of that. People are able to understand it as best as they can. Note if I prove that they don't own this art, I disprove this entire OP argument. One, because authors learn from experiences and people around them anyway. They don't own the entirety of their ideas, but also because reclarification of thoughts is a method of monopolization over the mind of other individuals, especially when we don't know if what the author could clarify is better or worse for the reader. Oftentimes, those reclarification mechanisms do not actually create an innate benefit for their side of the house. It instead creates significantly more harms. On a weighing of that, I think it's more important to prioritize the readers instead, right? But weighing, this argument is principally true as the sharing of ideas is flexible and cannot be taken back. Insofar as the ideas you gain from books cannot be gatekept, it is a public good that's non-excludable and non-rivalrous. Quite clearly, public goods cannot be excluded from people. On principle, this argument is also certain to happen. It's really, really important to prioritize this one actor over the actor of authors. And I think this is really important, right? Because obviously authors can also still freeze their ideas and experiences in that one book. But oftentimes, if you all walk down the street, for example, and you all see the same event, people can interpret it in different ways. But I think all those interpretations are correct, right? Because you're all things. Sources, but books are exclusive because these are a window towards opportunity and fantasy that we already explained to you is exclusive to this specific work, right? Why do you get greater enjoyment for readers on our side? Because writing is a window into your own life. This is a way for you to uncover social truths. Often, it is significantly more cathartic to believe that Marx was a poor man for writing the manifesto. On our side of the house, you can truly immerse in the text rather than get shackled by the thought that this text wasn't meant for me. This is really important because one, it encourages more critical thinking. You can connect your experiences to the specific text there. Two, creates inclusion of readers who maybe can't read that deep into Machiavelli, but can understand that this book is cool and can make me feel like I am in power over my life. This increases my net utility over someone. Three, because text changed meaning through a time, I don't need to feel ashamed or disgusted with myself for loving a book, a given text, etc. I can be in power of my own emotions and be able to apply my own life to it. I am more in control. I gain more agency and more utility. I think this is incredibly important and not just hedonism. Why is this really, really important in the debate and why is this round winning? One, because true meanings are not important. What's important is what comes from that meaning. Readers are the most important actor in the debate. As long as they gain greater amounts of benefit on our side of the house, it shows why one interpretation is more preferable. Two, this is also true across socioeconomic classes about diversifying the way people connect with ideas about life. Maybe some really rich people can benefit on the opening government. So many more people can benefit from our side of the house, and that's why we win the debate.
All right.
I have consent.
All right. So I think that you can just continue the recording because every other speakers are consented to. All right. So I would like to call upon a member of government to open the back house.
Can I be heard?
Yep.
Awesome. Your eyes try reading yourself, yeah? Or write it down. Anything works. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think it's very extreme for opposition to frame that no one originally had a right to anything just because as a human individual, you are able to think and interpret it to yourself. This speech I made today will always be mine. This motion the CA made will always be theirs, because that there's always a right nor ownership that is going to happen exactly because that is yours. That idea you have is inherently integrated with your childhood and your trauma and your experiences in life, right? But what will CG do? CG will come to this debate talking about criticism, because I think that criticism is the prerequisite for enjoyment, like what OG wants, for example, for self-environment and warnings of contents that can ruin and shackle your childhood, like what opening opposition wants to champion about, right? But before that, responses to opening opposition. First, OO's biggest point are discourses will be in a productive manner, like what LO said. First, question, what discourse? Because the prerequisite of discourses is a direct problem exists, right? That means you see a problem with this author being problematic, for example, and there's a discourse about what is the comparative. Under our side of the house, you are productive because there's a direct problem and one problem, right? But on opposition, discussion will never be productive because you have a lot of chaotic, differently interpreted problem, which is going to be unhealthy and stubborn because there is no end to the discussion at the end of the day. So at best, opening opposition discourses is just the comment section of Twitter talking about history of Indonesia, for example. He said debates that is not productive at all. Note that this response is exclusive on closing government and breaks deadlock on OG and OOs about discussion, right? Because CG explains it another way that discussion is not only can only happen under our side of the house, but it's extremely important. I'm going to do that in my argumentation. But second response is about how their argument about consent and childhood is going to be ruined. First, this is really weird, right? Because regardless if that of author exists or not, your childhood will always be ruined as you understand more things in life, right? And it's not only about the books or even the contents that you have, it's about everyday interaction. The fact that you constantly consume information from your friends, the fact that I maybe think that Tiana's song about almost there is like somewhat can be sexual because I'm not grown up, for example, that shows you that a lot of external factors really do have a role in interpretation of books. So you cannot just blame that into the author or even the book in general. This response is better than OG because what they say is, oh, then just let your child be ruined. We think we recognize how that could happen. We recognize what are the other external reasons that can apply in you, for you in integrating or even processing information from a book. 2 points of argumentation. Firstly, why that of the author hinders the true meaning of the book and what is important, right? First, I think why is the book very important to be filled by the point of view of the author is under 3 layers. First, a lot of authors write books based on their life-changing moments for the author. Principally is incredibly important, right? That's why they really want to put effort. That's why they even do interviews, for example, or wawancara, because they want to get the truest meaning and they don't want to hamper the reader. Second, because specific passage that the author wants to be, sometimes this passage or book is what the author wants to be known as, for example, right? That's why true meaning is really important, because people like Abraham Maslow, for example, wouldn't want their theory to be interpreted wrongly. Maybe, for example, just because Sigmund Freud talks about psychoanalysis, he doesn't want to be known as someone who is just horny all the time, because all these theories talks about sexuals as place in your psychology, for example. But thirdly, I think it's just incredibly principally unjustified to take the credits away to begin with, right? But not what happens in opposition when you do this, or when you don't oppose it, right? That means you are prone to misinterpretation, which I think OG never talks about. But secondly, are things with bias confirmation and interpretation that is very wrongly to represent a certain community. That's why things about minority being more disadvantaged exist diabolically on opposition. We say things like, for example, even though maybe there's things like maybe there's a book about racism, people can just do that or even manipulate that in order for you to blame black people to begin with, for example. This first argument is incredibly important because we think that sure, things like discussion, things like having your childhood is very flexible, but what's always sure is the principle of right ownership that only exists in opposing government, right? But second argument is about criticism and accountability. What's the status quo? People like J.K. Rowling, for example, that runs away by saying, oh, well, maybe Hermione is black, white, blue, ginger, is not in my responsibility to talk about because it is multi-interpretational from my fans. That's why under CG, you hold them accountable and you can directly criticize them exactly of my opening, that you can just put the fact that they have done this and that your name was on this, that your bacon was on this, and that's why you put that book out into the world. Why is the critics important? For 5 reasons. First, this is literally the development of literature. The fact that people criticize Gaby Hanna's book of poetry, which is really shitty, by the way, passively makes you realize that poem is not just Rupi Kaur, but a more important pieces of life and literature that people should value, just not for the aesthetic, but the value behind it, right? But secondly, check and balances from book that are hugely missed portrayal. That's why OO's argument about how, oh well, anonymous can also be valuable. No, because what you get is people writing on Reddit, for example, right? Under Author of the House, we can delete that, we can criticize that. Thirdly, I think people right now consume information with a grain of salt, and sometimes you cannot handle, right? Exactly what OO wants. We think under Author of the House, you have precaution because exactly you know, oh, the background of this author is a Nazi, for example, or a very far leftist. Therefore, you will not want to consume that because you know there's a flag out before you read that. So you don't have to have your childhood ruined. You can just not read the book in the very first place, ladies and gentlemen. But second, yeah. So that's what happens on proposition, right? Under Author of the House, at the very least, you don't have to be shackled by the system. And on opposition, you consume subliminal message because there is no flag out of or a warning for you to begin with in order for you to read that, right? So all the harms about how you're going to have a bad childhood, about how your misinterpretation is going to ruin your life, for example, happens exactly on opposition. At least under Author of the House, because you know who's writing this, because you know what's going to happen to you of the contents. Obviously, if that person is like really bad, then you just wouldn't want to read it, right? But what's the trade-off? Even if it is not relatable, even if you have less enjoyment, why is it still okay? Number one, because an art will never be enjoyable to everyone, right? And art is never made to always please everyone. That's why it is unique for the author in itself, and it's never characterized for anyone to enjoy just because it's going to be displayed outside, right? But secondly, I think you have a lot of option anyway. I think you have a lot of Disney princesses book. It's going to be white, black, and blue, whatever, right? But through what's going to happen on opposition is that because multi-interpretational exists, that makes a group of people who cannot relate to art feel secluded. The fact that maybe, for example, people say, oh, you have to enjoy people like songs or quotes that is edgy, and if you cannot enjoy that, you are not edgy enough, for example. That's what's going to happen in opposition. So we think that discourses happens under Author of the House. If you want a better literature to begin with, vote for opposing government.
All right, I thank the member of government for that speech. I call upon the member of opposition here.
Kak Omar, sorry.
Yes.
I do have connection issues. May I take a moment to like disconnect and then reconnect?
Yeah, sure. I can help by turning off my camera as well.
Okay, sure. Sorry, everyone.
Gue unmute loh tadi. Kelihatan unmute lagi.
Hello, so sorry for the delay. I'm back.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yep, you're audible.
Okay.
All yours.
Am I audible? Just checking.
Yes, you are. Yes.
Awesome. I'll start in a couple of seconds. Panel of adjudicators, art motion tends to be scrambled all over the place, and I will not let you do judgment call as per usual. This is the moment when I will tell you what this debate is and what this debate isn't, and why CO will take this debate. This debate is not about consent. We agree with what opening government said, that artwork takes form of life of its own. So opening opposition in that regard was kind of irrelevant. The only thing that they were correct about was that the author or the artwork creator don't own the art. It essentially takes life of its own. That they're right about. This debate, therefore, is not merely about discourse, because that is jumping into conclusion. This debate should take the precedence before that, and that is the way we reinterpret the art form. That is the way we interpret the artwork, the poet, for instance, the books, etc. Because the way that apparently all teams in this debate have thought was too fixated on the humans and not on the artworks. Very anthropocentric type of thinking, ladies and gentlemen. We agree that there are some arts which has political messaging, maybe Mein Kampf with Hitler, tied to mind, Il Principe with Machiavelli comes to mind, but art has two aspects. There is aesthetic and there is the messaging. This is the structure that all teams missed, because there are literature like Harry Potter, which has apparently no LGBT related content, maybe apart from Dumbledore, but it is not about LGBT struggles, but we politicize this. As if we interpret this art form that takes life of its own, that has no time and space limiting it, and attach it to mere mortals, to human beings, to its creators, which has time and space that are finite, ladies and gentlemen. And that is the harm that we think happening here. And that is what we need to talk about. Because I'm going to talk about two things. One, I will talk about the discourse, the relevance of time and space. And secondly, let's talk about the impact out of the subjectivity truth that opening government wants. I think also, if you want to talk about nuance, because apparently OG and CG wants that, I think all their arguments derive from this unnuanced characterization, by the way, which states that the word is either black or white. So if the author is deplorable, say J.K. Rowling, if you disagree with her politics, but the artwork is good, that you find it good, Harry Potter is good, then you need to find the artwork also deplorable because the author is bad. This is kind of black and white thinking, which I don't think encourages nuances at all, if you want nuances. I don't think there's any nuance of LGBT in Harry Potter, if you want to interpret it that way. I mean, good for you, but I think it's bad for the artwork. So firstly, let's talk about the relevance of time and space. Opening government clearly also stated that there is subjectivity within artwork. We agree with that, but that will be hampered by opposing the death of the author. Why? Because it's quite clearly that artwork has different meaning according to time and space. Orwell will be interpreted differently in 84 and right now, for instance. Pushkin may be more relevant for Russian readers in comparison to Shakespeare, just like Goethe and Schiller would be. Maybe they don't know, maybe people in Indonesia are less educated with Shakespeare and more about Tere Lee, for instance. So, of course, literature has relevance in accordance with time and space. With what they're doing, they're attaching it to the person who has the limited space within their own life. I mean, Marx only lived with Engels, essentially, with Frederick Engels. Engels paid for all his needs at the time. And this attachment between Communist Manifesto or Das Kapital, for instance, with Marx as a person is dangerous, because then you remove the separated discussion between Marx as a person, which might be to an extent kind of privileged because he lives on another person's account, with the writings itself. We think there has to be discussion obviously, but the discussion needs to be separated. So the author might be bad or might be good, but the artwork is independent in comparison to that. So when it comes to cases like Mein Kampf, Il Principe, you can say obviously that both the writers, the authors, and the books are deplorable. It condones the wrong messages, for instance. But those are the cases when both are bad, and you have those discussions separately. You discuss the livelihood of Hitler. You discuss the life of Machiavelli, for instance. Then you discuss Il Principe. Then you discuss Mein Kampf, ladies and gentlemen. Those are the discussion which removes that, because you discuss Hitler as a person who has limited time and space with all his backgrounds that opening government wants to talk about. Then you discuss Mein Kampf, you discuss its relevance today, you discuss the possible threat it may have tomorrow, for instance. And those are the discussion that we think is justified towards the artwork in itself, because even Mein Kampf exists now. Hitler is not. Il Principe still exists now. We can still read it. Machiavelli is not. So having those discussions separately allows us to have a better and more authentic discussion. Opening.
Isolated discussion can happen, but not in perpetuity. But your conclusion that a book is having no personalized, nuanced socio-political thoughts is your projection that hinges on your understanding of the author's overall experience. What if there was, and mainstream power decided there isn't, and sanitization happens?
This is the non-nuanced argument that I mentioned. Mein Kampf, of course, attached to Hitler. It's his thoughts, it's his beliefs, political messaging, the aspect of messaging and aesthetic. I don't think Harry Potter, for instance, on the contrary, has any attachment to anti-trans thoughts that J.K. Rowling has. I mean, this is as if all artworks are the same, all people are the same kind of argument. I mean, I don't really like that argument. So I think I'll just put that aside. So if you talk about interpretation, majoritarian interpretation and niche interpretation would always be there. So this is not a debate about majoritarian thinking like what opening government tries to tell you, or consent and empowerment like opening opposition tells you, because you can still feel empowered even after you consent. First, you can still consent to an argument of an author, but you can also feel empowered by the artwork. This is about the way we interpret the art itself, whether we think that it has finite space and time, just like the author, or we don't. We believe that it doesn't. For that reason, we oppose.
All right, I thank the member of opposition for that speech. To close the case on the government bench, I call upon the government whip. Here.
Check, am I audible and loud enough?
Yep.
All right. Let me set my timer first. POI strictly through chat only. Okay. My speech will start in 3, 2, 1. When Troye Sivan released the song of Angel Baby, suddenly the massive conservative Indonesian TikTokers tried to dim down the message by saying that, oh, the lyric also applies for hetero couples, and make it as an overflowing discussion and narrative, play down the message of oppression toward gay relationship and gay homosexual relationship. That is the democratic interpretation that opening opposition wants, the harm that they refuse to engage. So if opening opposition said the meaning is not the important, but the impact that they're going to have in opening opposition, because apparently opening opposition try to play in the utopic area just because you have democratic interpretation. I see no reason that why it is something that inherently good. Democratic interpretation or anything about democratic doesn't necessarily mean that it is inherent good. Why we better than opening government? Because opening government package your argument in a very beautiful way and explain to that how people will have more empathy and more reason to understand the artwork of certain artists and author to the point that they can create better discussion and such. But the problem in opening government is that they never explain to you why discussion is exclusive, exactly pointed out by opening opposition. But most importantly, they only tell you that why people have empathy without necessarily explain to you that how discussion is going to look like and how criticism will looks like on their side of the house and why it's going to be very effective. I think that that is an exclusive benefit and exclusive explanation that opposing government has already provided within this debate. All of my rebuttal toward opening opposition and CO is like intertwined within my case. First of all, the clarification. I think the counter mechanism that LO gave you about like, if you want to know about the artist and such, you can use autobiography. It's a very weak counter mechanism because we're talking about people want to understand and interpret literally an artwork, and the thought of certain artist and author autobiography did not give you that. It just gave you a full information without necessarily explain to you that the idea that they're going to represent to society and such. We don't think it's a good counter mechanism. But first of all, let's talk about the argument that opening opposition told you, that idea is a public good and people should have a full control upon their own interpretation. In theory, this argument is very beautiful, but in fact, it is utopic. This argument only flies if opening opposition can prove to you why individuals have capacity to independently interpret art. Unfortunately, they cannot. Most of your interpretation, the way you see life, the way you judge people around you, most likely controlled by your environment, controlled by people and the group called majority. In our side of the house, people who mostly cannot relate and have intellectuality to interpret certain art will have a flag about certain art and certain literature. Why is that so? Because interpretation is not only use imagination like what they want to have, because not all of the book are fairy tale like, right? So most of the book and literature also require some level of intelligence, which is hard for some people to have a massive and grandeur discussion, grandeur interpretation about certain art. These kind of people tends to consume the book and literature in the very literal interpretation and literal digestion. Why it is dangerous? Because even though you have book that is not directly talk about Nazi, for an example, there is still a subliminal message that you can consume from it about justifying pain infliction to be a hero that is respected by people. For an example, another example, like Disney princesses that always wait for Prince Charming, is a product of patriarchy imposed by hetero male named Walt Disney, for an example. On our side of the house, people that cannot have capacity to have an intellectual interpretation about certain art but have a flag about the lineage of this certain art, and they can flag whether or not they want to consume this kind of art, right? The more other tangible example is journal, for example, and journal interpretation. That people most of the time, journal interpretation use as their supporting fact in starting discussion. We're seeing recently white people using a journal and data, speaking about most of the victims of gun violence is actually white people and not people of color. But then behind the fact, we have no idea how the author got that conclusion, how the data sampling process looks like, whether it is objective or not. But when we are attaching the identity of this certain author and understand the author is actually white people, for example, we can take the information with a massive block of salt to not directly believe in that. Second manifestation is that some information is, even if you want to have a multi-interpretation of it, some people really cannot relate to certain literature, for example, simply because it's fundamentally is not matching with them. But under your side of the house, these people will be going to be alienated, for example, because they will be calling out as someone that's not edgy enough, or the one that's have no capacity to interpret a certain art, for example. For example, even though you're reading Communist Manifesto, for example, and you literally feels like you cannot interpret it in the moderate way, people will see it as an extremist right, for example, just because you do not want to read it. But on our side of the house, we can flag and play and using the identity and attaching it to a certain book, we feel like it is okay for you if you do not want to consume certain art and not consume certain literature because you have a right to do so. But second of all, talking about ruining childhood, the opening debate about ruining childhood is bad because they only explain to you that whether or not your child are good. But on our side of the house, you're going to be more aware about what kind of information that you're going to consume. It is not about raising awareness like opening government told you, but it's about protecting yourself and protecting your children at the end of the day to the value that you do not want to consume. But before that, opening opposition.
Right. So if interpretation is a collective imagination, as you said 3 minutes ago, then you can see that the collective must own it instead of the individual artist. You ran around in circles and shot your own case in the foot and conceded to our case.
No, I don't think that's what I meant. What I meant is that under your side of the house, exactly, even though it's a collective explanation, but in your side of the house, even if in your best case people have able to do this individual interpretation, there are some people that cannot interpret it. People exist in multidimensionality, not black and white, using the word of CO, right? Second of all, talking about critical analysis is also very dynamic in opening debate, because the discussion about he said, she said, that what will happen on their side of the house. When you want to criticize something, they say that why you want to criticize it. You should see this art in another form, in another interpretation, and it should not be a problem if you see it in another way. even though probably certain literature have a fundamental misinterpretation of minority, for example, and you need to understand where you understand where it comes from, you have idea where to start to criticizing and discuss about it. On our side of the house, you have no idea why Jesus looks so good in the book of Johannes and Bible, but right now you understand the special relationship that more Johannes have and say they have with Jesus, so you understand that why he's so exaggerating. But CEO said to you that art should not be politicized because art is multidimensionality. But art also exists in a lot of form. If you feel like you cannot relate to one art, you can go to another art. You don't necessarily need to force yourself. We told you that one art and one book is not supposed to be consumed by everyone at the end of the day. This is 2022. You can have a lot of options. We don't think that case is exclusive. Very proud to propose.
All right, I thank the government whip to close the entire debate. I call upon the opposition whip. Here. All right.
Test, am I audible?
Yes.
Test, all right. UI preference, just raise your hand in Zoom or chat. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Depth of author discussion is essentially deciding, do we want books and literature to go down and die with the authors, or should we just continue the legacy? It's essentially talking, do we want to perceive writings as immortal and able to transcend upon generation, or do we want the entire generation to assume content for individuality and persona? I think CO is the only theme that explains 3 main important things in this debate. Number 1, we talk about sustainability and relevance of literature and its significance to civilization, not only in current moment. Second of all, we talk about how do we maintain productive discourse from writing in collective basis, not only in personal level like OO. But lastly, we are going to do framing. I know this debate will probably be hard to judge, so I'm here to help. Okay, so first issue, right? I'm going to talk about author representation and expression from writing. So I think it's important to say that, okay, CG talks about how we need to credit the author because it's important and we need to acknowledge their feelings. I think there has been huge misconception from CG and also OG, right? We acknowledge that maybe it's true to validate experiences. Of course, it's important to validate what they're feeling and what they have undergo. And that can still happen if we discuss the content of the book, because they will write about the experience in the book, in the writing, right? So it's not mutually exclusive. So the important framing in CO is that we can always discuss the author and book separately. Book can be good or bad, author can be good or bad, but not because they write certain book, not because they write certain opinion. So you are not your work, like what we also feel like as corporate worker. So we think that is a very important framing from our side, because of course, if the author wrote about their experiences during slave era, for example, during imperialism era, of course it's legitimate and we would like to discuss. But what's important is that we see what's written in the book, but not because who write that book, right? So the comparison that's fair for opposition bench is that discussion with author persona versus no discussion at all, individual consume it on their own. No, the discussion that we prefer is that discussion without relation with author. We think what we want is no correlation with author as a persona. So I think CG case is essentially crumbled down with this framing, right? Because we can still have that, right? So I think we tackle CG. All right. Now, going to talk about point on OG. OG talks about how most probably there's going to be brainwashing on the culture of following majority. Essentially, they are talking about indoctrination, right? I think this argument has failed to win this debate. Why? Because this is argument against any minority literature or writing, right? This harm will still exist in government bench because majority will still have this antagonization with or without that of author. This characterization will still stay on them. And even on their side, it will even be more harmful because sentiment will become more prevalent due to the politicization of persona and cult of personality of this author. So we don't think that their harm stay, no thank you. Now, third issue, I'm I'm going to talk about discourse and taking meaning from art, essentially what Alfiki has told you about. There are two arguments from government bench. Number one, about representation of author. And second, I think DPM talks about how it's okay if the author is like, quote unquote, a bad person like J.K. Rowling, because then we can always research and read about that, and that's a benefit they want to claim. 3 layers of argument. Now, rebuttal, sorry. Number one, we don't think this is the only one way, right? I think there's no like explanation on exclusivity whatsoever in terms of why representation and doing more research can only be done with this, right? It's like, give me trauma so I can go to therapist. I don't think the world works that way. But second of all, I think this argument on representation and discussion rely on the best case scenario that people will be more than willing to research about this, right? No explanation on likelihood. But lastly, I think, and this is the important point that we brought on CO, is that you took away an important discourse, because now every writing, every literature that you read is going to rely on the individuality of author. And the inherent harm of that is that an author is a human figure. It's a temporary figure that should not represent the entire LGBT or African American communities during Stonewall era, for example, for LGBTs, right? So we think that the inherent harm is only brought in CO, right? Not found in OO. So the harm is that if now or in the future, people no longer relate to the persona, it loses the relevance and importance. And why is this bad? Because his story will most likely repeat itself. In government universe, if someone talks about slavery or colonialism that happens 100 years ago, people will only feel pity or empathy to the author because you feel pity to personalities, right? But that's it. We are not talking about the possibility of slavery repeating itself in modern context, with the context of corporates, for example. If we take the book based on the merit and what's written there, then we will be able to see, oh, that's what written there. I might need to be able to diagnose and see the common similarities and denominator between this book and my current reality right now. That way, the book will still be able to maintain its relevance even intergenerationally, right? And I think this is a very important contribution. Why? Because OO talked to you about entertainment, relatability, mental support, and a bit of leftism, right? But I think this impacts might or might not exist, because all of this happened on personal level, case per case basis, right? I think OO does not really show you framing of importance, why in personal level this will manifest into collective harm. CO brought you 2 main points of importance in which we showed you the scale on how we show you that there's collective harm, on how entire generation will not be able to extract and see what's the meaning of this book, because you only see George Orwell as a person but not as writing, right? But second of all, we also talk to you in terms of long term. We talk to you about time frame, on how death of author should talk about immortality of books and writings, and it should not like relate with how author will die eventually, right? So I think that's why we represent both the benefit of the author and the writing in on itself. We are very proud to close this debate.
All right, thank you everybody for the debate. That marks the end of the open final. You can return to the main hall as we will have the closing ceremony after.